Secondly, time where you have, oh, that wasn't meant to happen. Sorry about that. We're going to have a conversation with Nick Smart, who's an old friend of mine, and we've worked together several times. And Nick has a really interesting backstory of how he got into risk management that hopefully he'll share in a moment. And one of the things that he spent a lot of time working on is the ethics and compliance and governance aspect, which is something that not a lot of people pay attention to and not a lot of people really focus on. So in addition to picking up some things about risk in general, we're also going to spend some time focusing on that. So firstly, Nick, thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate you making the time and us being able to put this together. And I'd like to hand it over to you and ask you to let everyone know a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got into this field.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. My first 10 years of professional experience were in the military, which I guess you could loosely define as having a risk management component. I then left the military and went to work for a security consulting firm, mostly focused in Africa, and mostly delivering security consulting advice, but over time developed into providing slightly more coherent corporate level security risk management guidance. From there, I then went to work for a large energy services company in a security capacity, running the security function for that company. And with that, over a period of about 4 years, built a structure and a team and an organization that was capable of identifying and managing security risk for an organization that was working all over the world, lots of interesting, challenging places in the oil and energy sector, and helping to try and deliver that safely. In that function, I was part of a broader health and safety team, which is a very strong, dominant component of the oil industry, as you'd imagine. So there's some particular aspects of working in security in an oil industry that marry up nicely with the health and safety sector. From there, within the same organization, I was then moved across into the ethics and compliance space. Now, a slightly bizarre move, one might say, but actually moving within the risk management space, still delivering essentially the same background activity for the company to help it manage risks on a day-to-day basis.
I do want to talk about the risk and ethics aspect and the governance aspect in a moment, but just if you could, because the common theme here, as you said a moment ago, is risk. Can you just talk a little bit about what risk and risk management means to you before we get into some of the specifics?
Absolutely. For me, I think that risk management is in its first instance about understanding, as an organization, as a group of individuals, understanding the environment that you're in and the impact that that can have on you. And I think it's very easy to see times, places, both in your personal life and professional life, where you're blind to the environment that you're in, and you're potentially blind to the impact if something were to go wrong. And already start to use some of the language that comes out in risk management methodology. So for me, it's making sure that you're informed of the context that you're within, but also then the challenges and opportunities that being in that context offers to you. A particular focus on how any of those issues or opportunities might impact you as an organization, and therefore being able to do something about them before they come and knock on your door.
That's great. I particularly like that emphasis of challenges and opportunities, because it's easy to overlook. It can be a driver for growth. It can be a driver for taking opportunities and achieving objectives that way. So again, before we get into some of the specifics, you've got a lot of practical experience, but you've also been through some formal training. Just if you had to nail down some key skills, if somebody's watching this or listening to this and really wants to focus on some of the key technical skills, what are some of the things that you think are vital, the things you've gone back to regularly over and over again?
I mean, at its core, the basic risk management methodology that can be found in the international standard ISO 31000, that absolutely underpins pretty much everything I've done in my professional career since leaving the military. It was as relevant to security as it is to ethics and compliance and any other risk. So that for me is the absolute bedrock, and getting your head around that process and then having the opportunity to apply it, learn how it's applied, learn how it needs to be modified and adapted to suit different types of risk, but also different types of organization, different types of contexts, and different audiences. That for me is a sort of bedrock of a career in risk management and delivering effective risk management. On top of that, things that I found particularly useful are focusing on understanding the corporate environment. So understanding what are the concerns that keep chief executives and boards awake at night. And typically, people will talk very much about financial risk and possibly regulatory risk. It is less usual to find people talking about security risk as one of those top key concerns. However, going through the process of really getting under the skin of what the risks are to an organization often throws up that some of these things might as well be or should be the things that keep senior executives awake. So I think understanding those other risks are very important. I also think understanding what you do when something goes wrong at the end of all of this is absolutely critical. And that sort of that journey from understanding, assessing risk, but also recognizing that sometimes you're just not going to be able to stop the bad things happening. So understanding what happens at the end of it allows you along that journey of identifying, working out what you're going to do about a risk, and then getting on implementing that. You've got some solid knowledge there on which to build a coherent system.
Just in your experience, if you have found that difficult, or firstly, have you found that difficult to tie those things together to get people to look at all of their risks, their complete risk environment? And if that has been a challenge, what have you been able to do, or what things have you seen work as far as being able to get people to essentially look at all risks equally, rather than favoring, as you said, perhaps financial or market risk?
I think it is an issue, and I think the way that organizations are set up, there's inevitably areas of expertise with different areas of risk that essentially can create stovepipes of information, stovepipes of risk information, that unless they're coherently combined and treated together or assessed together, then there is the potential that an organization can go and start a new activity with high areas of risk high levels of risk in all different areas of the business, that maybe are just below the threshold above which you wouldn't operate. However, you don't realize that collectively you're carrying the most amount of risk that you ever dare, but unknowingly. So that's the fear, and that's the concern. One of the things I've done in the past is to work out what it is about an organization that really makes them tick. So again, coming back to the oil industry, safety is a mantra that you'll hear repeated over and over. So for me, allying concerns about people's safety with security, and essentially creating the case that it's one and the same thing, was a very effective way of springboarding security into the boardroom, into the senior executive suite, so that it was at least put on the table. And of course, if you provide the right information, you can't but realise the significance of some of the risks that you carry. So for me, allying with something at the core of the business is a critical way of getting in there.
I think that's a really good lesson, just aligning. Essentially, you're aligning everything with objectives, you're aligning everything with values, and showing where those tie in. So I'm torn because there's two separate ways we could go here. So let me just ask a quick question, because I want to move on to you're touching a lot on softer skills here. These aren't the hard technical knowledge skills. Before we do that, can you pin down one or two reasons in your experience why you think people tend to do this, why they tend to overlook risks, why they're happy to see everything is just under the level, not realizing that on aggregate it actually pushes them above their acceptable threshold? Or there's some common traits there?
I think when you look at the people in organizations that end up leading parts of the business, operational areas, practices, maybe another operation in another country, the type of people that you need to do those are entrepreneurial. They are self-starters. They're leaders. Potentially, they're visionary. You know, these are people that have stepped out and have been charged with the responsibility to deliver something, and quite rightly, they have become objective focused. What's the objective I want to achieve? Okay, how am I going to achieve it? So it's very easy along that way to switch your focus away, or try to ignore some of those small indicators and warning signs that maybe there's some issues on the fringes of what you're trying to do. And that's where I think there's a very key role for advisors who are objective, whether that be within an organization or from outside an organization. I think there's a strong role to play there in helping to snap everybody's focus to some potential concerns. But the flip side is, if you had someone in those positions of management responsibility who are driving new business and new activities, if you had someone who was solely focused on the risk at the expense of the objective, then potentially you wouldn't get to the end objective. Which is why I think there is a role to play for advisors, but there's also, of course, an education for those managers so they understand the impact of some of these risks materializing. And of course, as you well know, some of these can be catastrophic. So that it's not an optional exercise to consider risk. This is stuff that, in the absence of managing this properly, there are as many stories of failure as there are of success.
That's an interesting point, that the qualities to be successful in these challenging operations are also sometimes the qualities that can make people overlook the risks. And maybe just something to stress that's worth bearing in mind is that although sometimes risk management, security management, any of these preventative functions can seem at odds with achieving the objective, it's just worth reminding anyone listening to this that if you can position yourself to say that even if I'm offering something that sounds as though it's in opposition, I'm still here to try to allow you to achieve the objectives. And as you said, if it's simply someone focused on all the downsides, the negative, the objective will never be achieved. But at the same time, by collaborating with the people that are trying to move the project forward and achieve the objective for the business or the organization, if risk can be seen as supporting that, even if what you're saying sometimes can be seen as contrary, you're probably going to be more successful. So that's really bringing us on to the softer skills about building relationships, alignment, and working with people, because we've addressed the technical skills a little bit. So can you talk about some of the softer skills that you've found useful? You've alluded to some of those already.
So I think there's a tendency in risk management to make it feel that this is all about process. We have international standards, we have risk methodology, we might have definitions of what we mean by threat and risk and vulnerability and so on. But all of that is meaningless if it doesn't align with, one, what the business is about and what's important to the business, two, the culture of the organization, and three, the context in which you're operating in. So maybe to give a few examples, it's okay as a risk advisor to say, if you objectively look at operating in a particular environment, I think you're potentially going to carry quite a high risk in this area. Now, it's not necessarily for me to say whether that high risk is acceptable or not, and that's where the dialogue with the leadership of an organization, and not just the leadership actually, that the leadership needs to represent and reflect a broad organizational view. That's where we start to talk about a culture of organization and whether it's got the resilience and resolve to operate in potentially higher risky activities. So absolutely, in order to define what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you need to understand what it is that the organization is comfortable with doing. And this is where you come on to what's the role of the risk advisor. Is it someone that advises a management team of the risks that they face and then lets them take that information and decide what they're going to do with it? Or is it you're part of that management team, you're party to the decision, or are you much more independent and essentially you're providing an external set of eyes on a set of risks that a management team might not otherwise have within the organization? So there's a whole range of stuff there around how a risk manager, risk advisor leads a management team towards the decision that they ought to be taking given their organizational experience and capacity. Again, dropping down into the organization, this is all irrelevant if when an organization, or if when a management team ask its employees and subordinate business managers to actually carry out these activities, whether it be assessing risk or managing the risks that are identified. This is all meaningless unless those individuals buy into that same picture of risk acceptance, the same picture of the importance of managing risk in any given environment. And I think that's a role that I've felt strongly, essentially evangelizing within an organization about the importance of this stuff. And part of getting that message out is being available and being accessible, so that when a business manager, a business director has a concern or is feeling unsure about the decision-making process, then you're there as a supporting hand rather than someone who just puts up red flags and asks people to stop doing things. So I'm definitely a big fan of creating a positive space for businesses to do more activities. And the upside of that, of course, is that you might show a business area how effective it can be at managing risk in one place. That means it might open up other activities or other countries or other regions that they hadn't even considered operating in before. And that's almost a sort of nirvana state for a risk manager, is that you've facilitated business growth and prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you can, as you say, if you can move yourself from the point when you're seen as the person that keeps putting up red flags to being a driver of growth, then that's a very mature operation in all kinds of ways. There was a lot in that, and we could probably spend about 2 hours just unpacking some of the things in there. But you'd mentioned being available and being supportive. as far as the lower parts, say the operational parts of the business. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And then I'd like to talk about some of the corporate things and the cultural things. So you've talked about being available and being a supporting in a supporting role. Are there any other things that you found really help as far as your role at the operational level before we talk about the executive?
Slightly following on the same theme, being responsive to the needs of the operational level, even if it's not necessarily your own priority. So the number of times I was asked to get involved in a workshop, a strategy session for a level of business that perhaps wouldn't have traditionally have attracted a huge corporate kind of involvement, but nonetheless, involvement in those sort of types of sessions brought a voice to the table, a dialogue about risk, and an opportunity to bring all your experience to bear as another voice at the table. The benefit that then has, when all of the people involved in that are involved in other conversations about risk or other operations or much bigger, much more strategic projects that have a risk, have a need for very refined risk management, that you've magnified your impact from being one person potentially to having a lot of supporters out there and championing risk management. That's definitely been a big win in the past, and I think anytime I've failed to do that, I've had to go through quite a few hoops to repair and demonstrate that actually I'm part of a supportive capability of the company, and not as you said earlier on, not the bit that sticks up red flags.
I think what you're touching on there a little bit that's worth exploring is, it sounds as what you're describing as a move from being not opposed to risk management, but not seeing the value of it, to the mid stage, which is risk aware and understanding that it's there, understanding there's a need to engage with it, through to probably a risk culture where it's valued and people see the value. And I think you described that a little bit. Can you just touch on this issue of the cultural aspect of developing this risk culture? Because I think that's, I mean, you've talked on it briefly there, but I think you're in a positive way, you're making it sound easier than it is. I think it's what you've just described is actually a huge amount of work and a lot of effort. So you just talk a little bit more about that, about how you've been able to do that successfully, because that is, I think, one of the hard things that we can do as risk managers.
Mm-hmm. So when you start to talk about culture, it's very easy to think of a company as having one consistent face, set of values, set of principles, and everybody buys into everything that the company says. And of course, that's just not true. It's patchy, and when you're building a capability, you're raising awareness about a particular aspect of business, in this case risk, it's inevitable that some people are going to come along with you on that journey much earlier than others are, and that may be through their own personal experience. It might be coming back to my earlier comments about having been responsive, having had the opportunity to demonstrate value to some of their business activities, and being available and being a supportive peer within the organisation, and one who's helpful. So I think in terms of improving culture, it's important to identify who those people are, and they're obvious. They're the people who are responding to you and proactively seeking out for advice. I think it's important to identify who those are, and then to use those people as your champions in the organisation. So those people are essentially working alongside you, for you, in getting the message out, and also spotting and identifying things that would benefit from maybe the technical advice that a risk advisor might bring, whether it be security, health and safety, ethics and compliance, or the very process of identifying risk. So those champions are key. Beyond them, you've got a number of different challenges depending on the size of the organization. And having worked in companies with tens of thousands of people, the approach, the method of identifying and developing culture in a direction that you want is obviously very, very different to what you would do with a much smaller organization, maybe of 10, 50, 100, 200 people. But behind it is the same, it's the same set of concepts and ideas that everyone needs to buy into, namely a common shared set of values or beliefs or a mission statement or something in that space, which is really easy to dismiss as sort of corporate bluff that someone's come up with just to satisfy an external audience. Whereas my experience has been that if you create those with the workforce, and you really build it into everything you do, then people can genuinely buy into and get on board with those things. And that, for me, is the bedrock of culture upon which any part of the company can sort of latch onto, whether it's risk managers using some of those values as a vehicle to explain why it's important that we manage risk, because we potentially want to protect people, we want to do right by the communities who are affected by our projects, and so on and so forth. So I do think values is what maybe arguably seen as the softer side of a business, but for me, I think is absolutely fundamental because it talks about the DNA of an organization. And this is, I think, will start to become a non-negotiable part of corporate existence, whether a company likes it or not. Staff demand so much of companies now, perhaps in a way that they haven't done before, or perhaps in a more visible way than they've done before. Staff demand that they work for good, ethical companies that do things properly, that look out for their interests, but also for the interests of shareholders and other stakeholders. And this is the thing. I think this is the glue that holds it all together. That, for me, has been as relevant in managing security and making decisions about what's important to the company or an organization, right through to managing, specifically focusing on the ethics of an organization to prevent from having compliance blunders, for want of a better expression.
Could you just very quickly explain what you mean by ethics and what you mean by governance and or compliance, and then we'll start to unpick those a little bit and start focusing more on that level of the discussion.
So for me, compliance is about the things that an organization has to do. These are things that may be laws, it may be regulation, it may be what's absolutely expected by society of an organization. For me, that is about compliance. Ethics, I think that my favorite way of explaining it is ethics is about what you should do, even if no one's watching. So arguably, they're going to overlap considerably, these sort of corporate ideas of ethics and compliance. But for me, in the absence of regulation, a company has a decision about whether it does the right thing in any given circumstance. And there's a huge philosophical debate about what the right thing is. But there is a long philosophical lineage of great thinkers who essentially we've ended up in a position where, by and large, in society we have a general sense of what is right and wrong, and that is what then leads laws and regulation to come about. So it's very easy to say that whilst the ethics might vary in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, amongst different parts of society, by and large, and leading philosophers will take responsibility for this, not me, by and large, we've coalesced around a general principle about what is right and what is wrong. So for me, advising in and around the theme of ethics and compliance, I always saw compliance as being almost, I would say, a necessary evil. That perhaps that's slightly harsh. I'd say it's the necessary steps that must be taken to satisfy external obligations. Whereas for me, ethics was at the heart of every single decision and activity that the organization did, whether or not there was an external obligation. And that fundamental principle is a tricky one. So it's a tricky one, not just to get your head around, it's a tricky one to sell to a leadership of an organization and get wholehearted universal buy-in to that principle. It's also a difficult sell to the operational level of an organization when you have lots and lots of people from different parts of the world trying to convey this in a way that means something and means something to everybody is a tough nut to crack. However, absolutely possible. When I think of governance, I think there is a space for governance of that North Star. I think that, you know, we provide governance within an organization or of an organization to often, first and foremost, to make sure that we meet our external obligations. But that's not to say that that governance capability and the capacity doesn't also provide the ability to check that your alignment is correct. And that can be a microscope on a particular area of a business. It might be a sort of whole spread constant review of what the business is doing, but it needn't just tie to external laws and obligations. It can tie to those very values. So I've seen, for example, very effectively, that values have been operationalized into a specific set of behaviors and activities that are expected. And the flip side, there are very specific things that the organization has decided that it doesn't want its people to do. Some of those things have no external consequence as far as the law is concerned. However, the company has decided that they have a consequence as far as reputation particularly goes, potentially profitability, potentially staff retention, and some of these other areas that aren't going to land you in court. So for me, governance of those things is as important as governance of strictly legal compliance. I think another point you touched on was around almost around society's expectations of an organization, and we know that there can be a lag between society's changing expectations of not just the sort of business sector, but any organization. Society changes its expectations over time, and in some cases, laws and regulation take some time. There's a lag period. What an organization can't afford to do is to find itself doing things that are socially unacceptable, but legally, for the time being, acceptable. Tax, the questions around tax avoidance, tax optimization are a classic example where this argument comes to bear. Another good example I've heard from a peer in the ethics and compliance space who was operating way before I was in South Africa during the apartheid era, where legally companies were expected to make decisions about their workforce that ethically we would, by and large, everyone would recognize as wrong decisions. So in that case, there's a position where legally you can be above board, but ethically questionable. That for me presents a classic case where a risk advisor should be advising the company or an organization about whether it should be doing that kind of activity in the first place. And that for me is a point in an organization's activities where there's a real decision-making moment that leaders need to step up and make a decision about whether the values that they base their company on actually hold true, and they sort of stand that judgment, they stand that test.
So you've touched on this issue that ethics are doing the right thing even when no one's watching. You have regulatory compliance, which speaks more to an obligation to do something because of a legal standard. So we've talked about that. So one you're obliged to do. One is what you hope you will do to do the right thing, the ethical thing. But I can see instances where that would come into conflict with, bluntly, profitability. So for a business, the key metric they're judged on is going to be some kind of financial metric, whether that's profitability or return to shareholders. And that's a hard number. That's a very binary thing. But now you've got this issue potentially where you're asking a group of people who are judged upon their financial performance to consider doing things that they're not obliged to do. And moreover, doing those things may have an associated cost, which affects that key metric. So if you've come into those situations, without going into detail, how would someone going around addressing that? Because I've actually had some people ask me about this. So I'm curious how you've seen this arise and what techniques you've employed, whether they're successful or not. I think it's quite a complicated subject, but any light you can shed on it would be very useful.
So I think at the heart of this issue is a question about whether you see success of an organization in a short or long term, through a short or long term optic. I would argue that in the case where there is short term financial gain, potentially at the expense of doing the right thing, I would argue that will have a profound impact on the long-term success of that organization. And yeah, that does raise the question about companies that don't anticipate having a long lifespan. It's companies that potentially want to create value quickly and then move on. But my experience has been more with companies that want to develop, and I think which is the norm, companies that want to develop sustained high reputation brands within their sector that are going to last, create jobs, create wealth, create opportunity, and contribute to society. So I think in the quarterly meeting with shareholders, with analysts, with external stakeholders, I think it's clearly a challenge. It's clearly an issue. But I just think over time, the questions that those individuals, those external stakeholders are asking, they are changing, much like the expectations of the workforce. So increasingly, you'll find possibly a shareholder asking a question about environmental commitment, which is almost unheard of maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. But the whole sort of societal expectation changes, and there's a sort of couple of sides to that. Of course, if they're asking questions about it, you could argue, well, maybe there's a financial level of intrigue around this. Maybe it's that someone believes that the financial arrangements around environmental standards for an organization are going to change and incur costs which will affect their shares. I'm not naive, but as long as collectively society and regulation and the financial system are marching on this journey of increasingly being transparent, increasingly being seen to do the right thing, but also doing the right thing even when not being seen, I think will start to change those conversations. And I've certainly seen that be the case over time. I think the big test of this, though, is not the day when it's a normal quarterly, if such a thing exists, a normal a year where business is doing well, maybe improving, and maybe it's flatlining. I think the real test is when something significant has happened, maybe a significant incident has manifested within an organization that has become a crisis that they are managing, maybe a peer in industry, or maybe a whole industry has been affected by an issue. I think those are the times when the questions that are being asked by society, journalists, and those shareholders and stakeholders, I think they change. And that is, to me, is not the day to say, well, actually, we did that because we could see a quick financial return at the expense of one, our values, our defined values as an organization, but also your expectations and society's expectations. So there's very much a short-term, long-term thinking behind this. I think to add to that, for the chief executive or the chief financial officer going into that quarterly meeting, I would want to have the confidence that the things we say that we do as an organization, we do everywhere, across the whole set of activities that the organization does. It may be around the world, it may be in different parts of the country. But I would want to have the confidence that everybody is doing what we think it is that they're doing on our behalf. In my experience in large companies, and I'm sure it's the same in small companies as well, is that that's just not the case. Our organizations, to some extent, reflect society, and you're going to get people who buy into the processes and the tools and the systems that you employ, but also buy into the values to varying extents. And my experience has been that some of the biggest challenges that organizations have faced have come about because of a lack of oversight of very small minority groups of individuals or individuals that can cause real catastrophic harm for a company, that will most definitely change the questions that external stakeholders are asking. And the methods that you then employ, the methods that a risk advisor would be championing to a leadership and a management team, are very much around the idea of trusting but verifying what people are doing. That is recognizing that you try to recruit and employ people who are competent, providing them with processes to channel that competence in a direction that you want them to, trusting that they're going to be able to do their job and they will do it effectively and they will buy into your values and your beliefs. But then also verifying and saying, well, I can't possibly look our external stakeholders in the eye and say that everybody's doing everything on trust alone. I think that's a noble but foolhardy pathway that for a program of oversight and assurance across an organization that needn't be too pointed or too aggressive. I think that can provide real reassurance to the senior executive that values are being borne out in the deepest, darkest corners of your operations. That, for me, provides much greater reassurance. It means that your understanding of your ability to manage the risks that you've identified, it means it stacks up. And you coming right back to the start of our conversation, what do I think risk management is about? Is about understanding and really knowing your place in your environment. That, for me, is one of the key hallmarks of that.
So what do you do in a case where you have a willful lack of oversight because it helps the company? What would you suggest somebody do in that case? Or is there anything they can do in that case?
So for me, this is the kind of challenge that firmly sits on the table, on the desk of the chief ethics officer. This is one of those potential dilemmas with an organization that may not immediately be, the way of solving it might not be easily obvious. But I think the way that the chief ethics officer has potentially placed himself within that organization by being close enough to senior leaders to be part of the highest levels of conversation, but also being accessible to the people working at the operational level. So there's a couple of aspects to that. One is, by being accessible to the operational level, I find it very difficult to believe that if there is stuff going wrong in a part of the business, that if you create the right culture where they can talk to you about it, that someone won't speak up. So I've seen examples where someone would contact the chief ethics officer and say, I'm uncomfortable about this particular activity, and I would be keen for you to come and take a look. And then it's up to the ethics officer to work out a way of doing that sensitively, protecting that individual, essentially treating that individual as a whistleblower, and affording them all the protections that they deserve. As challenging as that is, I might add. But that for me comes back to what society expects. So I think that the chances are that there will be people amongst the organisation that have the same values and expectations as broader society, and so they will act as some sense of indication and warning of what's going on. Now then, there's a question of, well, what do you do about that when you're alerted to areas where perhaps business expediency, financial gain, trump doing the right thing. For me, absolutely, this comes back to identifying the right people at the senior level who are willing to back the values over the financial gain. And again, my experience has been that there are more of those people, a greater proportion of people fall into that category than don't. I think people who deliberately avoid doing the right thing are in the minority, thankfully. I think a great place to find these, particularly in publicly listed companies, are external boards of directors. Because of course their role goes right to the heart of governance and providing reassurance to external stakeholders, external shareholders. So it's more in their interest than it is even the executive management team's interest to ensure that what's going on is not going to create unnecessary legal risk or reputational risk that ultimately might create financial loss in the future. So I found that people who are within a board, whether it be an executive or a non-executive director or chairman of a board, those are people that that typically want to hear those concerns, those issues from around an organisation, even if an executive management team is so blinkered by the operational success, the difficulty of tackling a particular issue. I might hasten to add that the kinds of things you're talking about are not common issues. I mean, if you look around organizations, these are not common issues. But the problem is, when one of those issues comes to fruition, the result and the impact to an organization could be catastrophic. Worse still, when one or two of them happen, as far as external observers are concerned, then there's fears about the culture of an organization and whether an organization has the right values at its heart, and if it doesn't, does it not then have the necessary practices and processes to ensure that those values are borne out. And for me, there are two ways of doing that. One is through your risk management architecture, and the second is through this culture of assurance and trusting but verifying. So for me, at the heart of this is getting someone within a senior and empowered enough to put pressure and to support you in championing the cause for tackling the issues at the heart.
From what you've said, it sounds as though if you had to choose between one or the other, one being a hard risk management system, the other being a strong ethical framework, arguably the strong ethical framework will carry you through where you're not going to get all the results you need from a hard risk management framework. Maybe that's not a fair way of summarizing what you've said, but it certainly sounds as though these things are becoming more important, becoming more mature. So let me then pose that back to you. Where do you see this going? What developments have you seen, and how do you see ethics, governance, compliance, those things maturing, and where do you see that going in the future?
So I think, picking up on your example of where health and safety was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people got the idea over time that telling someone to wear a high visibility vest and a helmet is not going to stop, not going to stop them falling off a cliff. It's not going to stop maybe catastrophic incidents from happening. But the way that people move beyond that is to talk much more about individual concerns and recognizing the consequence of failure. And through a series of almost mindfulness exercises around safety, organizations which take this seriously have created, as you say, a culture where this is baked in on a daily basis. But I would argue that there's still quite a lot of effort that goes in to continue to keep that live and current. So, for example, in the safety space, it's not uncommon for high hazard industries to maybe talk about safety at the start of every single meeting that they hold. And that's a way of keeping it front of mind, keeping it present, keeping everybody engaged. And you could be cynical about these things, but the proof is in the pudding of a safety performance across industry generally that has improved over time. Coming back to ethics, I think we've been in a space where compliance has been the lead. So inevitably, it's about meeting a particular law, and therefore there's a process, a tick sheet, an activity that needs to be done. Individually, those things do not create an ethical culture, but they are part of it. Values, defining a set of values and defining how you operationalize those is a sort of next step for me. And typically in an organization, you might have a code of conduct, which, at face value doesn't look like a legal document, but actually the output of that kind of document, if sort of pushed into the organization right from inducting new employees all the way through bidding on work and managing projects, if that's done properly, then a code of conduct, I think, is the vehicle towards having people who consider the consequence of what they do. And that is just the music to the ears of risk managers who are trying to raise awareness about the consequence of particular activities and then doing something about it before it happens. So I'm a firm believer in a code of conduct, but then I'm also a firm believer in this sort of making things front of mind. And in an organization with lots and lots of people, that is quite some task, and you need quite a lot of financial investment and time investment to make that happen. You come back to the role of the risk advisor. I think the role of an ethics, particular area of risk advisor, is to champion champion the need for investment in this area, both from a time and money perspective, because this stuff takes a lot of time. I think it's not a quick journey either. So if an organisation hasn't been thinking about some of these things, we're talking a multi-year plan to really get everyone on the same page. And coming back to my safety discussions at the start of meetings, observation, in time, I wouldn't be surprised if those conversations extend to other things that are important to organisation, and ethics for me is a sort of bedrock of that.
I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to ask, I mean, we've covered an enormous amount, and to be honest, we could have probably done 4 hours on this at least. Mm-hmm. But is there anything else there's a huge amount here, but is there anything else that you think is worth stressing to people who are either have to be aware of this because they're a risk manager and they just have to be aware of ethics and compliance and governance, or anything that you would say is a sort of takeaway, a final takeaway for someone who has this role?
I think operating or advising around the philosophical idea of ethics within an organization is deeply rewarding. Having had a kind of career of managing different types of risk from the very operational level to a strategic level, my experience has been that ethics is the aspect which has provoked the most intrigue, it's provoked the most debate, but it's also provoked the most leadership attention, particularly after any successes in getting people to recognize the importance of living and breathing your values. So inevitably then, as a risk advisor, you go away from possibly seeing as quite a technical advisor to being a more strategic, supporting voice that almost provides a level of independence to a management team that they are considering the right things all the time. So for me, being involved as part of that conversation, having meaningful impact at that level of an organisation is the real kind of interesting and rewarding side of operating in this space. But the reality is, I'm considering all of the types of risk that I've ever been presented with before. So ethics is not a discrete area of risk. It underpins the decisions that an organisation makes about safety. It underpins the same decisions about security and whether you are willing or not to put people at unnecessary levels of harm. There is an ethical debate behind that ultimately informs the decisions you make about risk in whatever area it is. So for me, having come through a journey of security, on the face of it, security risk, a bit about safety into ethics, actually I feel well equipped in the ethics space, but I'm also using those other skills as a manager along that journey, along my career of managing people, managing teams, managing part of a workforce and managing how that workforce interacts with society, being a member of society. All of those things add up to being a responsible component of a company that helps it to see its place in society, helps it to identify the risks it faces, and helps it to hopefully protect itself from inadvertently or unwittingly having parts of its organization doing things that society or lawmakers or regulators would find unacceptable. I think it's important to stress that that's either protecting it from itself today, but also with hindsight in 5 years' time when the environment perhaps has changed. So all of that stuff makes it interesting because you're having to future-proof, you're having to analyze and kind of be part of society and guess what society's going to in the future. The upside is, I think that fundamentally behind all of this is a is a body of people that are supportive, but just need perhaps more education about the importance of this and the best ways of operationalizing this to generally give reassurance and create a coherent culture around doing the right thing.
That's a fantastic way to wrap up and end. I think that the thing that really comes across is this is the graduate level of risk management, because it covers everything, it runs through everything. Certainly much more complex subject, but as you say, one that's hugely rewarding. You've obviously had a huge amount of enjoyment tackling something that is highly complex, but also hugely rewarding for the organization, that if they get that right, they're creating long-term sustained value and benefit beyond just the balance sheet for the organization, for the staff, for the stakeholders, the environment community. So it's definitely a lot to think about. So Nick, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts. As I said, we could probably have done this for 4 or 5 hours. At some point, we may have a return to this, because again, we've only just scratched the surface, I think, of some of these. But thank you so much for sharing those ideas. Thank you so much for those insights. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.